2 weeks after rewriting his will, a man who had spent his entire life searching for genuine love was found dead in his own bed. And the last words his wife spoke weren't a cry of grief. They were a line she stole from a paperback romance novel. That one detail, that single, rehearsed sentence, was the first crack that would eventually blow this entire story wide open. Welcome to Signal 49, the place where we don't just retell cases. We take them apart, motive by motive, moment by moment, and ask the questions most people are afraid to ask. If you care about justice, if you care about vulnerable people being protected, if you care about how something like this can happen in the first place, make sure you're subscribed, notifications on, because what you're about to hear is not just a story about murder. It's a story about loneliness, vulnerability, and what happens when someone decides your heart is worth more dead than alive. This is the story of Marvin Elijah Washington, and the woman who pretended to be his miracle. A body the world wasn't built for. Marvin Elijah Washington came into the world on March 7, 1985, at Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. His parents, Leonard and Patricia Washington, had waited almost a decade for this moment. 7 years of fertility treatments. 7 years of maybe next month. 7 years of praying into pillows in the dark, asking God for a child. When Patricia finally became pregnant at 34, they treated every ultrasound picture like a sacred document. They argued over baby names. They painted the nursery a soft yellow because they didn't want to know the gender, they just wanted healthy. Instead, what they got was silence in the delivery room. Concerned glances. Whispers in the corner. Marvin was born 3 weeks premature, weighing just under 5 pounds. Almost immediately, doctors noticed that something was wrong. His arms and legs rested at unusual angles. His little hands didn't flex the way they should. His joints were stiff when they should have been loose and floppy. At 6 weeks old, the Washingtons finally got a name for what they were seeing. Arthrogryposis multiplex congenita, a group of rare conditions involving multiple joint contractures present at birth. In simple terms, it means the joints form stiff and tight, often because the baby didn't move normally in the womb. The muscles can be underdeveloped, tendons too short, a body that simply doesn't bend the way most do. In Marvin's case, the condition mainly affected his legs and lower spine. Doctors told Leonard and Patricia that their son would likely never walk independently, that he would need surgeries, physical therapy, adaptive devices, that the world would not make room for him unless they forced it to. Leonard, a construction foreman who had spent decades building houses and office blocks with his hands, stepped into the hospital hallway and cried. Not because his son was broken, but because he already knew the world would try to convince Marvin that he was. And that meant Leonard and Patricia had a decision to make. How do you raise a child to believe in his own worth when everything around him is designed to say the opposite? Building ramps and building a world. The Washingtons lived in a modest 3-bedroom home in Decatur, Georgia, a working-class neighborhood where kids still rode their bikes until the streetlights blinked on. Leonard picked up extra shifts. Weekends, nights, whatever it took. Not for vacations. Not for new cars. For surgeries. For mobility equipment. For physical therapy. Patricia, a former elementary school teacher, left her job to become Marvin's full-time caregiver. But she refused to let caregiver be the only word that defined their relationship. She was still a teacher, and Marvin from day one was her favorite student. Together, they made a quiet promise. They would acknowledge Marvin's disability, but they would not let it write the script of his life. Other parents of disabled kids talked in whispers about limitations and realistic expectations. Patricia and Leonard talked about options and workarounds. When Marvin was 5, Leonard didn't just build a ramp at their front door. He built one at his church, at the barber shop, at relatives' homes. He didn't ask permission. He just showed up with lumber and tools and said, "My son needs to go where your kids go. So we're going to fix that." Patricia's resistance was quieter, but just as powerful. She enrolled Marvin in the same schools as everyone else. She signed his name on every field trip, every science fair, every spelling bee. When other parents gently suggested special programs, Patricia smiled and said, "My son lives in the real world. He's going to practice in it." By the time Marvin was 10, the neighborhood kids didn't see him as the boy in the wheelchair. He was the kid who always had a book. The kid who helped you with your math homework. The kid who remembered everyone's birthday. Underneath all of that, though, something else was forming. Something nobody noticed until it was too late. A brilliant mind, a tender heart. Marvin was brilliant. By 12, he was reading at a college level. His IQ tested at 142, placing him roughly in the top fraction of a percent. By 14, he taught himself to code with nothing more than a second-hand computer and library books. He tore through physics texts and philosophy essays the way other kids went through comic books. Teachers threw words at him like gifted, exceptional, once in a career. But here's the problem. Being smart doesn't protect you from being lonely. If anything, it can make it worse. In his journals, excerpts later read aloud in court, Marvin wrote, "I grew up knowing that my body made people uncomfortable, and my mind made people intimidated. The combination made me safe to admire, but dangerous to love." At school, he was respected, but rarely invited. Football players gave him nods in the hallway, but never asked him to hang out after games. Girls in his AP classes called him sweet and so smart, and then politely declined his invitations to school dances. He went to exactly one, a Sadie Hawkins dance where girls were supposed to ask boys. A classmate asked Marvin as a friend. They took photos together. She danced with someone else the rest of the night. Years later, he wrote about that evening. "That night I learned that people can be kind without caring. They can include you in photos while excluding you from their lives." That realization planted a seed. Marvin began to believe that romantic love was something he would have to earn through performance, perfection, sacrifice. That he wasn't inherently enough. He would have to prove his worth to whoever chose him. And a belief like that? It's a blueprint for exploitation. Adulthood, success on paper, silence at home. On paper, Marvin's adult life looked like a success story. He graduated at the top of his class, received multiple scholarship offers, eventually built a solid career as a remote software developer for a medical technology company. The kind of job tailor-made for someone brilliant, detail-oriented, and physically limited in mobility. He bought his parents' house when they were considering downsizing, promising them, "You'll never have to worry about a landlord again." He volunteered at a food bank. He showed up at church every Sunday. He was the guy people went to with computer problems, with questions about forms, with "Can you help me understand this email?" As the years went by, Marvin's world got smaller. Asterisk friends moved away or got busy with marriages, kids, careers. Church people said, "We should grab coffee sometime," and never followed through. Dating apps designed for disabled people brought a mix of fetishists, saviors, and people who tried for a few weeks and then just faded away. One woman who briefly dated Marvin later said, "He was genuinely kind." Not the kind that wants something. But he was always waiting for the moment I'd hurt him. Like he'd already written the ending. Relationships would start with hope and end with quiet withdrawal. Not yelling, no cheating, just slow-burning disconnection. By his early 30s, Marvin started saying things like, "Maybe some people just don't get that kind of love. Maybe I should accept that." To friends, it sounded philosophical. To his brother Darnell, it sounded like resignation. 2 deaths and a secret fortune. In February 2015, life punched Marvin in the chest. Patricia collapsed while cooking dinner, a massive stroke. She died that night at the hospital. She was 62. 6 months later, Leonard died in his sleep. Officially, heart failure. Unofficially, everyone who knew him said the same thing. He died of a broken heart. Marvin was 30 years old when he buried both his parents within half a year. No siblings in the house. No nearby extended family. Just him. A wheelchair. A quiet house full of memories and medical equipment. Then the phone call came from the attorney. For years, Leonard's small construction company had slowly grown. Patricia had quietly invested her leftover teacher savings. There were also life insurance policies Marvin hadn't even known existed. When everything was tallied, the total stunned everyone. $7,542,000. Enough to change anyone's life overnight. But Marvin did something unusual. He didn't move to a gated community. He didn't buy a luxury car. He didn't redesign his home into some tech palace. He hid the money. He placed the bulk of the inheritance into long-term trusts and investment accounts. He kept a modest checking account for everyday bills. He kept driving an older van outfitted with a wheelchair lift. He stayed in his parents' modest house with the same worn-out couch and the same creaky floorboards. He told almost no one about the inheritance. Not coworkers, not casual friends, not even most of his caregivers. Why? Because Marvin already lived with one visible factor that made people treat him differently: his disability. He couldn't bear adding another, millions of dollars. And he was right to be cautious. Research has shown that people with disabilities face a much higher risk of abuse and financial exploitation, often from those closest to them, including partners and caregivers. Marvin understood that instinctively. He just didn't realize that one day, someone would go looking for exactly what he thought he could hide. Someone is watching Marvin. Between 2015 and 2018, Marvin's life shrank into a routine. Work from home. Weekly church. Volunteering at the food bank. Occasional online dates through platforms meant for disabled users. He wasn't flashy. He didn't brag. He didn't post about his inheritance. But that didn't mean he was invisible. Somewhere in that period, in a bar where people talked too loudly over music, Marvin's name came up in the wrong conversation. A clerk at the law firm that had handled his parents' estate mentioned him to a friend, a disabled guy who inherited millions but still lives like he's broke. That friend repeated it to someone else. And eventually, it reached Dominique Latch Harris. Dominique didn't meet Marvin at church. She didn't bump into him in a grocery aisle. There was no meant to be. No destiny. There was research. The making of a predator. To understand what Dominique did to Marvin, you have to understand who Dominique had already become long before she ever typed his name into a search bar. She grew up in Macon, Georgia, the oldest child of a tired housekeeper and a father who drifted in and out of the picture until one day he just stopped coming. As a kid, she learned 2 brutal truths. 1. Stability is fragile. 2. People sometimes give you things if you make them feel good about themselves. Teachers later remembered her as the girl who always knew which adults would give her extra food, which ones accepted late assignments, which ones had softer boundaries. Not in an obviously cruel way. Just practiced. As a teenager, she discovered how powerful a smile could be. Her first serious relationship at 17 wasn't about love, it was a blueprint. She realized someone else would pay her bills, co-sign loans, and help her get ahead if she performed the right emotions at the right times. Over the next decade, Dominique perfected a system. 1. Identify a target, usually lonely, generous, financially stable. 2. Become exactly what they've been looking for, attentive, understanding, vulnerable in just the right ways. 3. Create dependency. Share sob stories, emergencies, just this one's crises. 4. Extract resources, money, loans, access to accounts, legal documents, housing. 5. Disappear or detonate. Break up in a storm of accusations or vanish without closure. Researchers call this kind of behavior a scripted fraud pattern. Fraudsters literally rehearse roles and emotional beats to construct fake soulmate connections with their victims. Dominique didn't think of herself as a scammer. She thought of herself as someone who used what she had, her looks, her charm, her ability to read people, in a world that hadn't given her much. But by 2017, her trail of broken relationships and damaged credit histories was long enough that a detective in Savannah had quietly started asking questions. Dominique could feel the walls closing in. She needed one last mark. One that would set her up forever. And when she heard about Marvin, disabled, wealthy, cautious, and lonely, she knew exactly what to do. Terrell, the man in the shadows. Dominique did not work alone. Since 2012, she'd had an on-again, off-again boyfriend, Terrell Jackson. Terrell was the kind of person people describe with a sigh. Handsome, charismatic, completely unreliable. By 30, he'd cycled through dozens of jobs, multiple evictions, 2 children he didn't support, and a handful of minor criminal charges. To Dominique's targets, he didn't exist. To Dominique, he was her partner, her backup, her pressure valve. Their deal was simple. She found the targets and ran the emotional operation. He provided backup, intimidation, when necessary, help moving money, and someone to talk strategy with. The money? They split it. For years, that was enough. But when Marvin entered the picture, Terrell saw something different. Not another small score. A way out. Text messages later recovered would show that it was Terrell who first raised the idea of taking more than money. He wrote, "He's got millions and nobody watching. We do this right, we never gotta do it again." That phrase, "nobody watching," would turn out to be wrong. There was someone watching. He just didn't know it yet. The match, "I don't see the chair." On March 14th, 2018, Marvin received a notification from a dating app called AbleMatch, a platform marketed for people with disabilities and those open to dating them. The message read, "Hi Marvin, I saw your profile and you seem like someone who thinks deeply. I really admire that. I'm Dominique. What are you reading right now?" This message didn't come from nowhere. Before sending it, Dominique had spent days combing through everything about Marvin she could find online. Old speeches from school award nights. Photos from volunteer work. Book quotes he'd shared. Comments he left on disability advocacy posts. She built a psychological profile without ever meeting him. She knew 2 key things. 1, that he led with his mind. 2, he was painfully aware that most people led with his wheelchair. So her first line did something very simple and very powerful. It pretended the wheelchair didn't exist. They started talking. Books. philosophy, faith, family, loneliness. Marvin mentioned Dostoevsky. Dominique mentioned The Color Purple, a book she hadn't actually read, but whose theme she'd skimmed online that morning. For Marvin, the conversations felt different. No intrusive questions about his medical history. No weird fascination with his disability. No condescending praise like, "You're so inspiring." Just two minds, supposedly, meeting on equal ground. Weeks later, when they finally met in person at a coffee shop, Marvin was so nervous he arrived 20 minutes early. When Dominique walked in, wearing a yellow dress and a practiced smile, she crossed the room like she wasn't debating whether to sit with him. She'd already decided. They talked until the staff started stacking chairs. And then she said the line that would echo through this story. "I don't see the chair. I see you. And I really like what I see." For Marvin, that sentence felt like sunlight cracking open a locked room. For Dominique, it was just one more piece of a performance she had already rehearsed. Rehearsed love. Over the next months, Dominique began folding herself into Marvin's life. She showed up at his house more and more, offering to help with tasks his paid caregivers had always done. She started joining him at church, laughing with his friends, hugging the older ladies who'd watched him grow up. She learned his routines, his medication schedule, his sleep patterns, his fears. And she did something extremely calculated. She never asked him for money. No emergency rent. No, my car broke down. Can you help? Nothing. In the world of romance scams, that's a known tactic. The longer a scammer waits before making financial requests, the deeper the emotional hooks can sink. Instead, Dominique crafted moments where Marvin would offer. She mentioned a small medical bill, then brushed it off as "I'll figure it out." She talked about wanting to visit her mom, but not wanting to spend on a plane ticket. She downplayed her needs while making sure Marvin heard every detail. When he insisted on helping, she resisted a little, then reluctantly agreed, always with phrases like, "I don't want you to feel like I'm using you. This is about trust, not money." Those lines did two things. One, they let Marvin feel like he was in control. Two, that they covered her in a layer of plausible innocence. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Dominique and Terrell texted like co-workers planning a job. Plans. Timelines. How long to wait. How far to go. Marvin thought he'd found someone who finally saw him. In reality, Dominique saw nothing but numbers, vulnerabilities, and documents she hadn't gotten him to sign yet. A brother's instinct. In July 2018, Marvin's older brother, Darnell, drove down from Charlotte to meet this woman his brother couldn't stop talking about. On the surface, Dominique nailed the performance. She was charming. She asked about Darnell's kids. She praised Marvin, not in the "you're so inspiring" way, but in ways that sounded thoughtful. But there were tiny fractures. When she thought nobody was watching, the softness in her eyes disappeared. Her gaze sharpened, assessing Marvin rather than adoring him. Her answers about her own family were vague and rehearsed, just enough detail to sound real, not enough for follow-up questions. Every affectionate gesture in public had a performative edge, as if she knew someone might be watching and wanted to make sure they saw the perfect couple. On the drive back to his hotel, Darnell told his wife on the phone, "I can't put my finger on it, but something about her feels off, like she's playing a role." His wife warned him, "Be careful. If he accused Dominique and was wrong, he could lose Marvin's trust." So Darnell stayed quiet, but he didn't stop watching. And eventually, his quiet suspicion would become the one thing that cracked this entire case open: the proposal and the paperwork. On Christmas Eve, 2018, Surrounded by a small tree and the fading warmth of a fireplace, Marvin proposed. He didn't give a polished speech. He gave something raw and painful. I've spent my whole life feeling like just existing was asking too much. Like wanting love was greedy. You made me feel like I might actually be enough. I don't have fancy words. I just know I don't want to live without you. Will you marry me? Dominique cried. She said yes. When Marvin fell asleep that night, drained and happy, Dominique texted Terrell. He proposed. I said yes. We're close. Terrell's response was cold. Good. Don't rush the next part. He has to think it's all him. The next part wasn't dress shopping. It wasn't venue hunting. It was legal restructuring. Over the next 8 months, Marvin made a series of decisions that, in isolation, looked like normal premarital planning. Adding Dominique as a beneficiary on his checking account. Updating health insurance to eventually cover her. Revisiting his investment portfolio. But there was one decision that would later be described by legal experts as a flashing red siren. On August 1st, 2019, just 2 weeks before his wedding, Marvin signed a new will. The old will, written after his parents' deaths, left everything to disability charities, organizations that helped people like him modify homes, get equipment, live independently. The new will, everything, the entire $7.5 million estate, the house, the investments, went to Dominique. Under Georgia law, a will can be challenged if there's evidence of undue influence. Basically, if the will reflects someone else's mind instead of the person signing it. But in that moment, with Dominique sitting beside him, gently correcting the attorney's questions, Marvin didn't see manipulation. He saw commitment. He told the lawyer, "She's about to be my wife. She's the only family I'll have. I want her taken care of if something happens." The attorney later said something felt off. Dominique answered most of the questions. Marvin seemed distant, not disinterested, just emotionally overwhelmed, almost as if he were signing something he believed was already decided. 2 weeks later, that new will would become the foundation of a murder case, a wedding and a countdown. On August 15th, 2019, Marvin and Dominique were married at the same church where Marvin had grown up. Photos from that day are emotionally brutal to look at. Marvin in his chair, tears in his eyes, grinning like someone who finally made it to the finish line. Dominique, bending down to kiss his forehead, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. Darnell standing beside them as best man, smiling for pictures while something in his gut screamed that something was wrong. Dominique's side of the church was nearly empty. She explained that her family was complicated, that she'd had to set boundaries for her mental health. No one knew how many people she'd burned through in the previous decade. No one invited them. No one thought to ask. There was a small reception. There was cake, dancing, toasts.
Your subscription enhances the signal. Kindly subscribe if you haven't.
After the church ceremonies, Marvin and Dominique went home to the house Leonard and Patricia had poured their lives into. The countdown had already started. Will changed, August 1st. Wedding, August 15th. Death, September 14th. 44 days from changing the will to the funeral flowers. Coincidence? Or a schedule? The plan inside the house. Marvin and Dominique did not take a honeymoon. The public reason, traveling with Marvin's disability, was complicated. They'd go later. The private reason, according to texts later recovered, Dominique and Terrell didn't want to wait. He suggested October. She stalled. He wants to go to Hawaii in October, she texted. "That's too long," Terrell replied. "People start noticing things." In the background, something else had been quietly put in place. During that uneasy visit in July, Darnell had done something his brother never knew about. He hid a small camera inside a decorative clock in Marvin's living room, a cheap motion-activated device he bought out of fear he couldn't even fully explain. He checked the footage once. Saw nothing unusual. Almost took it down. Almost. That camera would capture 3 critical late-night visits in the weeks before Marvin died. Terrell entering through the garage, a door Marvin almost never used because it was difficult with his chair. Dominique letting him in after midnight. Whispered conversations in the kitchen. The audio wasn't perfect, but some phrases were clear enough to punch a hole in the courtroom when they were played for the jury. He's an easy target. Wait until after the insurance goes through. Friday after dinner. He takes his meds at 9. By 10, he'll be out. What if he wakes up? He won't. And if he does? You do what you need to do. 4 days later, they did exactly that. The night of the murder. September 14th, 2019. By evening, Marvin's house looked like any newlywed home settling into a Saturday night. At around 6:30 p.m., Dominique cooked dinner, grilled chicken, rice, vegetables. They ate at the table. Nothing in the recording suggested an argument. No raised voices. Just quiet conversation. At 8:15 p.m., Dominique handed Marvin his nightly meds, a combination of muscle relaxants and sleep medication that kept his pain manageable. He swallowed them with water. Told her he felt tired. Asked for help into bed. Because of his mobility, Marvin depended on someone physically assisting him to transfer from chair to mattress. That meant when Dominique helped him lie down that night, she also positioned his body in a way that would make it almost impossible to fight back later. At 9:02 p.m., she texted Terrell. He's out. At 9:34 p.m., a neighbor's security camera caught Terrell's car pulling into the alley behind the house. At 9:41 p.m., he entered through the garage. Dominique met him inside. What happened next was reconstructed from autopsy findings and the fragments of audio the living room camera picked up. Marvin was in bed, sedated, deeply asleep or close to it. His cause of death would later be listed as asphyxiation due to smothering, most likely with a pillow pressed over his face. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of a struggle. Disabled victims, especially those already sedated, often lack the ability to fight back physically or even call for help. Sometime between 9:45 p.m. and 10:15 p.m., Marvin took his last breath. At 10:47 p.m., Terrell's car was seen leaving the alley. At 11:02 p.m., Dominique dialed 911. Her voice shook. She cried. She begged. She said, "My husband isn't breathing. He promised he would never leave me. Not like this." Those last words, "not like this," sounded emotional, poetic, almost cinematic. Later, a detective would recognize them. Not from Marvin. Not from any text. From a romance novel Dominique had been reading days before. She didn't just rehearse the crime. She rehearsed the grief. Funeral, doubt, and a memory card. Marvin was buried 1 week later, September 21st, at the same church where he'd been married just 37 days earlier. The sanctuary was full. People from disability organizations he'd quietly donated to. Volunteers from the food bank. Co-workers who had never met him in person because he worked remotely, but who showed up because he was always the nicest guy in the group chat. Dominique dressed in black. She sobbed. She clutched a framed photo of Marvin like a lifeline. She collapsed theatrically at the graveside. To most people present, she looked like a devastated widow. Darnell stood a few feet away, watching. The night before the funeral, he'd spoken to the family attorney, the same man who had handled the will change. When Darnell heard that Marvin had rewritten everything just 2 weeks before his death, naming Dominique as sole heir, something inside him hardened. The lawyer admitted. She did most of the talking at that meeting. It felt rehearsed. The next day, after the funeral, Darnell drove to Marvin's house under the pretense of collecting personal items. Dominique barely looked up from the stack of paperwork she was organizing. "Take whatever you want," she said. "I can't deal with any of it right now." Darnell walked to the bookshelf in the living room and picked up the decorative clock. The camera had been running for months. Back at his hotel, he slid the memory card into his laptop. Normal days flashed past. Cooking, TV, chores. Then the date stamped August 20th appeared, and he watched Terrell step through the garage door. Darnell watched one clip, then another, then the one from September 10th. He heard "Easy Target." He heard "Friday after dinner." He heard "He takes his meds at 9. At some point, he stopped the video, threw the laptop across the room, dropped to his knees and screamed, because in that moment, he understood something that would replay in his mind for the rest of his life. If he had checked the footage sooner, even a week sooner, his brother might still be alive. That guilt nearly broke him. It also turned him into something else. Not just a grieving brother, a man on a mission. The investigation begins. On September 23, 2019, Darnell walked into the DeKalb County Police Station carrying his laptop and the tiny memory card. He asked to speak to a homicide detective. That's how he met Detective Mariana Santos. She watched the footage. Then she watched it again. When it ended, she asked Darnell 2 questions. Does Dominique know about this camera? Does anyone else know this exists? Darnell said no to both. Santos told him something most true crime stories rarely mention. This is huge, but it's not enough by itself. We need corroboration. If she learns about this camera before we're ready, she'll run, and we might never find her. For the next 4 months, Darnell had to do one of the hardest things a person can do. Nothing. No confronting Dominique. No cryptic Facebook posts. No anonymous letters. Just waiting while detectives quietly built a case. They subpoenaed phone records. They pulled bank statements. They interviewed neighbors. They analyzed Marvin's medication levels and autopsy. They followed Terrell's car through traffic cameras and gas station security footage. The picture that emerged was devastating, but clear. Thousands of text messages between Dominique and Terrell spanning years, including Marvin's entire relationship arc. References to targets, timeline, and permanent solutions. Financial records showing Dominique moving money out of Marvin's accounts within days of his death. Careful small transfers designed to dodge fraud alerts. Airline reservations for 2 first-class tickets to the Maldives, booked 2 days before the murder, paid with Marvin's credit card, in Dominique and Terrell's names. By early February 2020, the detectives were ready. Arrest warrants were issued. On February 4th, Dominique opened the front door of Marvin's house, the home she inherited from the man she killed, and found armed officers standing on the porch. She didn't cry this time. She froze. Terrell was arrested less than an hour later at his mother's place. For years, they had treated people's lives and trust like expendable resources. For the first time, someone said, "Enough." Interrogation and the 8 words that ruined everything. Dominique's interrogation lasted 7 hours. For the first 3, She played the same role she'd played with Marvin, with Darnell, with every man before. Crying, denying, framing herself as the victim of misunderstandings and jealous people, insisting she loved her husband and would never hurt him. Detective Santos let her talk. Then she slid a photograph across the table. A still frame from the hidden camera showing Terrell in Marvin's kitchen. Dominique said she'd never seen him. Santos placed a second photo, Dominique and Terrell at a club in 2016, his arm around her waist. Santos told her, "He's in another room right now, telling us everything." Cracks started to appear. Dominique said, "He's lying. Whatever he told you, he's lying. He says we planned this together. He's lying. He says I told him when Marvin would be asleep. He's lying. He says I watched while I didn't watch." Silence. Those two words, "I didn't watch," were like a trapdoor opening under her own feet. She didn't say, "There was nothing to watch." She didn't say, "Marvin died in his sleep." She acknowledged, without meaning to, that something had happened worth watching. From there, she never fully recovered. She never gave a clean confession. But over hours of talking, she admitted enough. That she and Terrell had been together for years. That she knew about Marvin's inheritance before they met. That she intentionally sought him out. That their relationship was strategic at first. That she let Terrell into the house multiple times. That she coordinated his visits by text. She claimed she thought Terrell would only scare Marvin into releasing more money. But when asked why she waited so long to call 911, why she didn't check on her husband for over an hour after Terrell left, she had no answers. According to the medical examiner, Marvin had been dead for at least 90 minutes before Dominique picked up the phone. That hour and a half? She spent it cleaning, changing clothes, and rehearsing the perfect widow's performance. The trial. The trial began in October 2020, under the shadow of COVID restrictions. Inside the courtroom, the narrative played out in two competing stories. The prosecution's story. This was a calculated, financially motivated murder. Dominique and Terrell targeted a disabled man specifically because he was vulnerable and isolated. They carefully reshaped his legal documents, then killed him once his assets were secured. The hidden camera, the texts, the bank records, and the vacation booking were all pieces of one cohesive plan. The defense's story for Dominique. She was just another victim of Terrell's manipulation. She'd been pressured into things she didn't fully understand. She thought Marvin's death was an accident or something Terrell did on his own. The defense's story for Terrell. Dominique was the mastermind. He was just along for the ride, expecting some money but not knowing murder was part of the plan. Evidence doesn't care about stories. And in this case, the evidence shredded both defenses. The jury saw clips of Dominique and Terrell calling Marvin an easy target. Financial charts showing money moving out of Marvin's accounts and into Dominique-controlled ones almost immediately after the funeral. Copies of the will and insurance changes lined up against the murder timeline. Airline confirmations for the Maldives trip booked before Marvin's heart stopped beating. They also heard from experts about how often disabled people are targeted by partners or caregivers for financial gain, and how rarely those cases ever make it to conviction. After days of testimony, the jury deliberated. It didn't take long. Both Dominique Harris and Terrell Jackson were found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced them to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Dominique cried when the sentence was read. Not the wide, performative sobs from the funeral. Smaller tears this time. Real or not, only she knows. Terrell stared straight ahead. Neither apologized. Neither addressed Marvin's family. the brother who couldn't save him. Before sentencing, the court gave Darnell Washington a chance to speak. He stepped up to the podium and looked at the two people who had dismantled his brother's life. He talked about Marvin's childhood, about the ramps Leonard built, about Patricia's stubborn insistence that her son belonged everywhere. He described how Marvin's brain worked, how he could explain complex programming problems in ways a 10-year-old could understand, how he stayed up late helping coworkers with bugs he'd never be paid extra for. And then, he turned to Dominique. My brother didn't want pity. He wanted to be loved. You saw that. You saw exactly how badly he wanted it. And you turned that into a weapon. He also did something most people are too ashamed to say out loud in a courtroom. He talked about his own guilt. I suspected you. Months before he died, I felt something was wrong. I put a camera in his house because I didn't trust you, and then I didn't look at it. I told myself I was overreacting. I told myself to let him be happy. I was wrong. He took a breath. But you don't get to feel guilty, because that would mean you have a conscience, and you don't. When he finished, Darnell didn't look back at them. He walked out of the courtroom into the bright Georgia sunlight, carrying two realities at once. Justice, as far as the legal system could give it, and a loss no verdict could ever fix. Aftermath. What happened to Marvin's money? After the trial, Darnell did something his brother would probably have wanted. He undid what Dominique had tried so hard to secure. He sold Marvin's house. He liquidated the remaining investments. Then he donated the bulk of the estate to disability-focused organizations, the same kinds of groups Marvin had originally named in his first will. Programs that help people modify homes and vehicles, independent living support, legal advocacy for disabled adults facing abuse. He also created a foundation in Marvin's name, aimed at paying for accessibility projects, ramps, stair lifts, bathroom modifications for people who, like Marvin, were born into a world built for other bodies. Front-facing, he talks about accessibility, justice, and prevention. Privately, he lives with a different narrative. If I had checked that camera sooner, my brother might be here. That part of the story doesn't make it into headlines, but it's important because it raises a question that matters for every viewer. How early do you act when something feels wrong?
Where they are now, Dominique Harris and Terrell Jackson are serving life sentences in separate Georgia correctional facilities. According to officials, neither has received visitors since the early post-conviction period. No family, no friends, no supporters. In the crime statistics, there are just 2 more inmates serving time for murder. But in the disability advocacy world, the Marvin Washington case has become a warning about how easily love can be performed rather than felt. A warning about how often disabled people are targeted by those who claim to care for them. A warning about how romantic scripts can be weaponized into lethal tools. Researchers and advocates now point to cases like Marvin's when pushing for better screening, support, and legal protections for disabled adults in intimate relationships. But for the people who actually knew Marvin, none of that turns his story into a case study. For them, it's still just Marvin, the boy in the yellow-painted nursery, the teenager with the too big backpack and the too bright mind, the man who wanted nothing more extravagant than someone to come home to. The questions that don't go away. There's one part of this story that might be the hardest to sit with. If that hidden camera hadn't existed, if Darnell hadn't listened to the voice in his gut, if he hadn't bought a cheap little device and stuck it inside a clock, Dominique would be a wealthy widow right now. Terrell might be with her on a beach somewhere, and Marvin's death would be just another tragic natural causes at a young age obituary. Which leads us to some uncomfortable questions. How many people are living in relationships where the "I love you" is just part of a strategy? How many disabled adults are financially, physically, or emotionally abused by the very people who claim to be their caregivers or partners, and never see justice? How many times have you, personally, explained away red flags because believing the worst felt too painful? We like to believe we'd spot a predator. We like to think, if someone was using me, I'd know. But people like Dominique don't just lie with words. They lie with gestures, with shared playlists, with inside jokes, with perfectly timed tears. They study what you fear, what you long for, what you regret. Then they mirror back the exact version of themselves you've been waiting for. That's why romance scams and financial exploitation work. Not because victims are stupid, but because they're human, and human beings want to believe love is real. Marvin Washington wasn't naive. He wasn't foolish. He was lonely. He was hopeful. And he believed that finally, someone saw past his wheelchair. What he didn't know was that this time, the person looking back at him was measuring something else entirely. Not his worth. Not his heart. His net total. To the viewers, if you're still here right now, listening to Marvin's story all the way through, I want you to do two things. Comment the words. Backhand index pointing right, "I see you, Marvin." So Darnell, and everyone like him, knows that this story reached you. Tell me where you're watching from. I want to see how far his story travels. And one more thing. If you know someone who is isolated, disabled, or dependent on others for basic needs, check in on them. Not just once. Not just with a text. Really check in. Ask who has access to their bank accounts. Ask how their partner treats them when no one is around. Ask if anything feels off. Sometimes, one uncomfortable conversation is all that stands between a vulnerable person and a headline like this. If you want more deep dive cases like this, not just what happened, but why and how, make sure you're subscribed to Signal 49 with notifications on. If you'd like to support more investigative storytelling, extended cuts, and behind-the-scenes breakdowns, you can join the channel membership. The link is below. Thank you for spending this time with Marvin's story. Thank you for caring about people the world often overlooks. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and never stop asking who's really behind the crime.